Hey folks, how we doing? Is anyone here with me yet? Wait a few minutes. We are going to be talking today about the previous administration and our current administration. I think a number one question that I know that I get, I assume that you're getting them too, is I have a lot of friends who come up and will say, do you think that this administration is doing better than the previous administration when it comes to immigration? So I'm going to talk with Jenny Yang at World Relief today about that. She's going to come on here in just a second. So, hey, Ben.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good.
Good.
We're matching in our cream and tan.
Oh, look at us. Yeah, I don't know about you, but I have my kids on the other side of the door with snacks and a don't disturb sign.
Snacks and a nice show are always helpful.
Yes. The last time we did this together, Jenny's kids came in full force to the room, and it was just delightful. So, we might have a circus today. That was funny though. We had it under control. It was good.
Yeah. How is the weather there? Are your kids home from school today?
One of them is. Yeah, we had 2 back-to-back snow days. Anybody else? Raise your hand if you had a snow day. Did you have snow days?
No, it's raining here. It's been raining, but we had snow days 2 weeks ago. They had off 3 days out of the 5, but they've been in school. So we haven't actually gotten any snow in Maryland, at least in the Baltimore area, DC area. We haven't gotten any snow. So
nice.
Yeah.
Well, for those of you who don't know, Jenny's on the East Coast and I'm in Colorado. And so we are going to be answering the question today that both of us have been asked a lot, but that we know a lot in our community are getting asked too. And that is the previous administration, the current administration, is the current administration actually doing a better job or a worse job than the previous administration when it comes to what's going on in the immigration space right now? So let's start with just some generalities, and then we'll get into some more specifics. So let's talk about tone and tenor versus current versus previous. What do you see? Because I feel like the rhetoric is definitely very different and better.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest differences I've noticed between the previous administration and this administration is in the previous administration, there was a lot of negative narrative around stereotypes of who immigrants were and why they were trying to cross the border. There was a lot of vilification of immigrants themselves, and a lot of that narrative wasn't just rhetoric and narrative. It manifested itself in actual policies that were very harmful to immigrants. And so I think in this administration, you do see a market because the president has been very, I think, receptive in his narrative towards immigrants. I think he's tried to put forward an immigration reform plan that really outlines a framework by which we can actually try to change our immigration laws that I think has been better as well. But I think, immigration is always a very complicated, very challenging issue. And anytime there are political considerations, it complicates the picture even further. And so there were a lot of policy changes as well as rhetoric changes that have been for the positive, but I think there still remains a lot of significant challenges where a lot of us who advocate for immigrants and refugees and others feel like there hasn't been enough progress within this administration. But I think the foundation to have goodwill in the conversations and really starting from a place of empathy and compassion to a certain degree is there and present more in this administration than it was in the last.
Yeah, and I think when I have this conversation, what I would say is there's a difference of intent and there's a difference in rhetoric for sure, but there's a difference in intent where a lot of the previous administration's policies and actions were really aimed at being more harmful and more framed as punishment for coming to our borders or attempting to go through a legal process of seeking asylum, in which they would, go through that vetting process and be weeded out as valid or invalid, or if they had a credible fear or not. And so the intent was more of a punishment and of kind of this harsher deterrent kind of narrative. And this administration seems to have shifted that to a more humane way of speaking of people that are coming, whether or not they're they're carrying on some of the same policies or not is something we'll probably get into here in just a second. But I do think that the overall tone is a whole lot more humane, and which lends itself to really thinking about the people behind the issue instead of just the policies at stake. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that having that humanity in the conversation where there's a level of empathy, where when we think about immigrants, we're not vilifying them as people
Right.
to be feared, but we're trying to understand why they're coming and addressing root causes. I think those are critical facets of, again, what's a very complicated issue. And so anytime someone tries to simplify immigration to, it's us versus them, or it's, bad versus good, I think there's a level of dehumanization that occurs because every person's reasons for migrating and experiences are so fundamentally different. And anytime you simplify it to just an us versus them, you overlook a lot of that nuance. And so for those of us who follow Jesus, believe in the dignity of others, there has to be an immersion, right? In understanding the other person's story, and in understanding that narrative is where I think we can really start to begin to craft good policy and really have a framework for which we can have this conversation.
Right. So I guess maybe we should get into some specifics, because some people, I felt like around the holidays, there were lots of conversations probably at people's tables about immigration. And it's never a very easy conversation to have. So having some concrete things that you can point to and say, okay, so the tone and tenor are very different. There's still some things that are very dysfunctional. There's some things that were tried with good intent that then became a bigger problem. But maybe let's start with some of the good things, and then maybe we talk about some of the things that are still concerning to us, or things that we wish would be different that he would actually fulfill on, that maybe he talked about in his campaign. But what are some of the good things that we think that we're seeing? I think number one for me, I think the Family Reunification Task Force has been a really high note, a positive. They've a lot of work ahead of them, but I think the creation of that has been very good.
Yeah, President Biden, when he came into office, really needed to have a lot of executive actions that would restore a lot of fundamental basics of what is a more humane immigration system. And creating the Family Reunification Task Force was definitely one of them. I think the American public in general, whether or not you supported Trump or not, did not agree with the fact that there were families being separated at the border. So he did attempt to do that. The task force still exists. The Biden administration is continuing to try to reunite families, because under the Trump administration, there were over 5,000 separations, and the Biden administration was able to reunify a little over 2,000 of these individuals. And there still remains, hundreds that they're still trying to identify. And they've also created legal avenues through humanitarian parole by which these families can actually be reunited in the United States, which is also a positive. And so there's some legal avenues that they're advocating for now that would allow some of these families to have reprieve in the United States, which is ultimately probably best for these families to try to be together. And the other thing that the president did when he first came into office is really repealing a lot of the discriminatory bans that the previous president had put in place.
Right.
So there were several travel bans that existed when President Biden came into office. There's ones that actually suspended some travel from immigrants from Muslim majority countries from coming into the United States. There was executive orders President Trump issued that allowed for extreme vetting of certain applicants of certain nationalities, which President Biden rescinded, all because they were unnecessary and inefficient. And then there was also other travel bans related to COVID-19 that was basically rescinded as well. And so there was another rule where the Trump administration basically, it's called the public charge rule, where they basically the US government could deny visas based on whether or not that individual was receiving public benefits. And the president basically rescinded that rule and was not applying that means tested benefits application to applicants. And so that was another positive change, which resulted in a lot of immigrants being able to gain immigration benefits without having to prove that they wouldn't be a burden to the U.S. government. And so those were a lot of the initial actions that President Biden took to basically repeal some of the discriminatory travel bans and other restrictions on immigration that we're seeing as well. And so I think when you look at the overall year of the Biden administration, I think there were multiple setbacks, though. I think he had a progressive and expanded vision of reuniting families, ending the migrant protection protocols, which basically forced asylum seekers to remain in Mexico, and then also pushing an aggressive immigration reform bill. But we haven't seen immigration reform pass in Congress, even though it's controlled by the Democratic Party, both the House and the Senate, and the Democratic president. The Family Unification Task Force has to continue its work. And I think probably the largest area we've seen the most disappointment in is what's happening at the border. There's been continued turnbacks of those who are seeking protection in the United States, and there continues to be a lot of concerns about the way that the administration is implementing various rules that have really, we think, harmed those who are trying to seek asylum in the United States. And so, again, some good initial actions in the very beginning, and then, some progress over the year. But again, I think there continues to be a lot of concern about needed areas of improvement.
Yeah, and I think when you look at overall, I think at the very beginning of his term, he was allowing unaccompanied minor children to be processed at the border. That was not happening in the previous administration. But then there was concern that was really kind of a perverse incentive and a new way of family separation. And so now we're kind of seeing a little bit of, there are some families with tender age children being processed at the border, but that's not being consistently applied across the border crossings. And so it's just kind of a gamble for young families that are coming in who don't know our asylum or immigration laws, much like most Americans as well. So it's very hard to understand where to go and what to do when you are fleeing a valid fear that you have or persecution that you have experienced. And so again, yes, so good things. Family Reunification Task Force, reunifying those families that were separated during the previous administration, taking in unaccompanied minor children so that we're not creating kind of this vacuum on either side of the border. That was a huge human trafficking concern. Trying to repeal that MPP, Remain in Mexico, although that's now needing to be reinstated. Unfortunately, we still are very concerned about Title 42 being in place and sending back the majority of families. And there's also just still this big concern about people having the ability of due process when they show up at the border, because it's being applied so inconsistently right now, because Title 42 is still in place and so is MPP is being re-implemented. So we still do have some very big concerns and some campaign promises that he had issued that just really still are in a big holding pattern.
Yeah, and I would say that there's a couple other positives that I just want to mention as well,
Yeah.
just so we're aware of what the president has done. So he did reprioritize enforcement priorities for ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And so under the previous administration, we saw a lot of worksite raids, which were devastating for families, because kids would be in school when their dad was at work at a chicken factory, and then they would come home from school and their dad would be deported back to their home country, and the kids wouldn't see their father again. And so there hasn't been work site raids as we saw in large under the Trump administration. And that has been a positive development. Another part of interior enforcement is also looking at the people that ICE is prioritizing. And so under the Trump administration, really, they could have picked up any immigrant and deported them immediately. But now ICE is really focusing its resources on those who are a national security threat to the United States, which means that, for the vast majority of immigrants that are not a national security threat, that are here to work, they are deprioritized for enforcement, which allows our government agencies to really focus their efforts on really trying to target those who are trying to do our country harm and really trying to, deport these individuals as well. And so I think, all of those have alleviated some of the insecurity that immigrant communities have faced under the previous administration. And then the other thing I would say as well is when you look at, because we're still living in a pandemic, the Biden administration has really tried, in addition to reprioritizing enforcement, facilitating greater legal immigration. And so, they've been opening up consular offices, visa processing centers, so that those who have applied for immigration benefits can actually get those petitions processed. And so I think, the Biden administration has been trying to reduce waiting times for immigrant family petitions and others that really are impacting immigrants that are trying to come here as well. And so those are, I think, a couple positives. On another note, temporary protected status is is a temporary immigration status that is offered to certain countries where there's a humanitarian disaster. And so the Biden administration has really utilized that, I think, to a good degree to offer protections for individuals from Venezuela and Burma, for example, and Sudan and South Sudan, among other countries. And so even having TPS expanded under Biden, I think, is a good sign, although there continues to be advocacy for other nationalities to be included. So these are all things around, the legal immigration visa processing system, temporary protection for nationalities that may be vulnerable, and a reprioritizing of interior enforcement that really has seen a lot of improvements, I think, for vulnerable immigrant communities. But again, I think probably the area that is lacking the most, or where we want to see more progress, is really what's happening at the border. And it's really involving two policies, which is Title 42 and the Remain in Mexico or Migrant Protection Protocols policy.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, in that, I feel like dreamers always get missed too. I mean, we still need a permanent solution for dreamers. So Women of Welcome and World Relief both have a ton of information on what we would love to see happen for dreamers. These are kids who are brought here by their parents when they were very young, and that they are here and they've lived in this country 20, 30 years, and they don't know any other home other than the US. And so looking for a permanent status for them here in this country. So let's talk a little bit just about, as we wrap this up, just like actions that people need to be paying attention to, things that people should be either praying about or getting involved in or aware of. The first thing that comes to my mind is some of these pushbacks from state governors against federal funded OR shelters or licensing for shelters in some of these states. We saw a pushback from Governor Abbott in Texas saying that he wasn't going to renew, or he was going to revoke licenses for care centers, many of whom are faith-based, if they were going to keep in their scope taking care of children, or what we're going to work with the federal government in order to take care of migrant children who are here waiting and on their way to be connected with sponsor families, because we know the vast majority of kids who show up, they have a relative here in the US. It's 80 to 90% of these kids have someone that they can connect with. And so now, people of faith, state of Texas, a lot of these organizations banded together. And so Texas Governor Abbott actually pulled back on some of that and was allowing allowances for care of migrant children in the state. Now we're seeing that with Governor DeSantis in Florida, which is very concerning as well. Florida has a long-standing reputation and of being a care center, of being a care state. I mean, all the way back to the Cuban crisis in the 1960s, they have always had these licensed child care facilities to take in vulnerable children. And now we're seeing that, a pullback from that, and a difficulty happening in that space. So one thing that I would flag is if you live in Florida, is that Women of Welcome has a letter that we are sending to the governor saying, we are people of faith. We don't want to pit one vulnerable child against another. And that we'd love for you to join our voice in that and petition the governor to kind of pull back on that as well. So anything else on your mind, Jenny, that you feel like people need to be aware of or take action concerning?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's been a legislative priority for World Relief is the Afghan Adjustment Act. And so
Yes.
many of us know that a lot of Afghans, over 50,000, were paroled into the United States. And so they have been here under what's really a temporary immigration status. And so many of the Afghans that have come under evacuation from the US government are now having to apply for asylum to have permanent status in this country. And what we've been saying is, instead of applying for asylum in a system that is significantly backlogged, Afghans should have the ability to be able to adjust status and get a green card without having to go through the asylum system, which we know will take many, many years for them to do that. And so we have historical precedent for the US government to do this. For example, Cubans for a long time has enjoyed special immigration status. And there was a Cuban Adjustment Act passed in which over 1 million Cubans, if they landed in the United States, could basically automatically get a green card. And so because Afghans were themselves evacuated and vetted by our US government, we feel like have a responsibility to offer them more permanent status with additional vetting that would automatically come from them getting a green card than them having to go through an asylum system where the outcome could be arbitrary. And so that is something we're pushing Congress to do. And so especially if you live in the state of Iowa with Senator Ernst and Grassley, in North Carolina with Senator Tillerson Burr, and other states, we are really looking for Republican support, in particular in the Senate, on the Afghan Adjustment Act. And so please reach out to your senators and members of Congress to push for that. And so that's been a top legislative priority for us. I also think just continuing to pressure and the Biden administration to be compassionate and generous towards asylum seekers at our border is going to be very important. The continued use of Title 42, which is a public health rule that has basically expelled nearly every immigrant from entering to the US because of COVID-19, is something that has really detrimental impacts towards those who are seeking asylum. And so many humanitarian organizations have said that there has to be an end to Title 42. And so I think if we see progress in that, that would be very welcome as well. And then even just lastly, the Biden administration ending the Remain in Mexico policy, which has forced a lot of asylum seekers back into Mexico to await their hearing, has been significantly problematic. And so, the U.S. has a responsibility to have immigrants who are in fear of their lives pursue their cases within the United States, especially when they can access legal counsel and they have family members here, and over 90% of them show up to their court hearing. There's no have them remain in Mexico, where it's very dangerous for them in that situation. So those are the 3 areas that we were really looking for improvement on this year and for Congress to pass in terms of legislation.
Okay. Well, a lot of work to do per usual.
But I think, this conversation was helpful because, it is good to talk about in 1 year the differences and the improvements that this administration has really undertaken with the support of many of you and the advocacy of many of you. But just to encourage everyone to know that the work continues. And we know that there are certain values of this administration that we want to hold them accountable to. And I think for us as a people of faith, making sure that we preserve asylum space, that we continue to protect vulnerable children and families, I think are values that need to be enshrined in our laws and systems. And so please continue to raise your voice and make immigration a political priority for this administration, despite all the challenges. And I think if we do that, we can see more progress in these areas.
Agreed. Yeah, so stick around, stay in touch with World Relief and Women of Welcome. We continue to keep you up to date on ways that you can use your voice and things that are going on that matter and that need your support. So thanks so much for tuning in with us, and we will be in touch at another time. Thanks, Jenny.
Yep. Thanks, Bree. Bye, everyone.
Bye.